Behold, my glorious supporter EyePatchNotes has requested Buildcraft as buses the finale? EyePatchNotes says, may I roughly conclude the discussion on the perspective Buildcraft as buses. For October, I would like to present the argument that it is possible to use a game piece incorrectly given system knowledge. Here are the questions. What are a given game piece's functional outputs at low and high investment, and how much mental overhead is involved at higher investment? Investment here may mean thought. It doesn't have to mean like investing money or in-game resources or something. Time, space on your team. And we're going to use Genshin Impact as an example for this one. I'm going to show you all a visual reference that EyePatchNotes made for this parlay. We're going to talk about it, and then we'll get into this question. But the core of it, I like to always give some sort of anchoring point, is the idea that when evaluating weapons, you're going to hear people say that something is the best in slot choice for a lot of kinds of games. And that is hardly ever true. Or if it is true in a game that you play, maybe that game isn't as great for making build options. Provided there are a good number of options and the game has meaningful choices, the game has good build options in it, whatever that means, then there won't be something that's the best. And you just have to gauge what you're willing to do to make an option good or bad to enable it. If the game designers have done basic addition, then there won't be something that is just the best, except in very limited situations. So this parlay kind of digs into how you might parse out, think out whether an option is right for you, because that is really the only meaningful way to evaluate things in games that have real options. And overall, I really appreciate EyePatchNotes' series of parlays because they've often been about, what the actual components of a game being interesting are, rather than just saying a game has interesting buildcraft or whatever, which doesn't mean anything. Just like how saying something is a roguelike or a looter shooter doesn't really mean anything. And if you think it does, then you've gotten very lucky when following that genre around. I promise it isn't actually addressing what you actually like about games. What does address that is, well, this, like discussing, why do people like this option and some other people like this option? Like, why? What is that? And how do I decide for myself which one makes more sense for me? Because looking at how much damage they do isn't a useful way to decide that. Let's take a look at this chart. So here we have Razor from Genshin Impact, and we have two Claymores. In the orange or tan, I guess orange, we have Prototype Archaic, which simply does a burst of damage when you hit enemies. It's got a 50% chance, and then it's got a 15-second cooldown. Over here, we have the Star Silver, which is a little more complicated. When you hit, it doesn't have a random chance. You do a burst of damage, but it's a lot less damage. You can see at the bottom of the columns. Column C, you can see Archaic at full refine does 4.8 times your attack damage. Star Silver does 1.4 times your attack damage, a lot less, but it's every 10 seconds instead of every 15. And if you have cryo on the enemy, you'll see that in column A, the damage goes way up to 3.6 times your attack. So it's a 10-second cooldown, and it does less damage if you enable it than the Archaic. But because the cooldown is shorter, it should do more total damage. The cooldown is a full third faster than the Archaics, but it doesn't do proportionally less damage. It does less damage, but not quite a third less. So it's theoretically slightly better if you just have like all the cryo applications. There are a few other differences between the two weapons, but we're not going to focus on those for this parlay. That's what they do. That's the comparison. So you can pretty clearly see that one of them is basically like usually better or better if you don't enable it. And then the other one offers some amount of additional damage if you play to its strengths. So the question is how much more damage and how much more work. Again, knowing how much damage each of them gives you on its own doesn't really matter without knowing how much more work or the opportunity cost that would take. And EyePatchNotes has made this graphic which pretty clearly demonstrates what those costs are. So we're going to talk about it a little bit more. The baseline, EyePatchNotes says, is the sort of 3-step process or bus schedule in columns B and C. So if you do column C, you apply cryo or electro, then you complete superconduct by applying the other one, electro or cryo. The enemy's physical resistance goes down, and then you normal attack, or maybe a few times to get that 50% chance. And you do a bunch of damage. They both do physical damage. So you can do the same thing with the Star Silver, but as established, you do way less damage. There's a lower cooldown, but you do far less damage with the individual activations. So the Archaic is a lot better if you don't plan to have cryo afterward. But the team that inflicts superconduct, you do have a cryo unit on that team because you made superconduct. So what if you applied cryo again? Well, you have to wait for the internal cooldown on reapplying for an element. And if you do that, that takes some time. You will then get cryo again, do a normal attack, and get more damage. Again, on its own, this is now giving you a little more damage than column C, but column A costs some time. What could you do with that time? Well, column D shows that you could do like razor attacks. I don't know, like your character could hit a guy. And if it's razor, for example, you can do a bunch of his electro abilities, his skill, his burst. Here they're in purple to indicate like you'd be applying electro. And because you have to have cryo by itself in column A, you can't do any of that stuff that you're doing in column D. So you have to, Razor can just do it afterward, but you have to wait while you activate Star Silver. Whereas if you just use the Archaic, you can use that time to do all this other stuff. And Genshin Impact is often a game about time, about how quickly you can do some amount of damage, about how much opportunity cost you're spending with your team's rotations. Things will be back off cooldown or charged up again if you wait a little bit. And so just spending that time in between cooldowns, getting a lot of damage is really good. That may not entail standing around applying cryo one time, or you might have a team that applies a truckload of cryo and you're fine unloading all that stuff during the cooldown on applying cryo again. It depends on the team. There isn't a way to quantify them. It just depends. The community is addicted to saying that there's one that's just the best in slot or whatever, but this clearly demonstrates how there is not. Of course there isn't. It's way too dependent on the situation, you, the individual player, how flexible one's account is. And EyePatchNotes makes a few other points that I'll get into now, but that's the sort of premise. You can't really have one that is just the best, because they simply ask different things of you, and it's variable how much those things will cost. The Star Silver doesn't give you much more damage than the Archaic, even if you set it up, but setting it up may be basically free, or it may be rather unrealistic. It depends on the fight, it depends on your team, it depends on you as a player. There isn't a way to quantify that. You just have to kind of decide based on those factors. EyePatchNotes continues. You are not required to jump through those mental or physical hoops. EyePatchNotes says both the correct and incorrect attack scalings are right there on the Star Silver, so it does kind of have written on it. The weapon sort of says on it, hey, you could use this wrong. Like this, you might do it wrong with this one, And from EyePatch's perspective, the haunt or threat, I love that, of accidentally having noodle tier damage is enough to keep certain game pieces in the bin for you. And for me too sometimes. Again, in this case, my evaluation is that the Star Silver gives so little additional damage that it's simply never worth it. It just isn't ever worth it. It isn't, and no matter how small the amount of work is, the finickiness, there just isn't enough I'm gaining. It's not more powerful enough in exchange. I'm not sure that's bad. There's a question here about if it was a lot better, do they then need to be careful about every character that can activate it pretty easily? Like there are some situations where getting that cryo to be on there constantly just isn't much of an ask. And in those situations, any extra power you give the Star Silver for being enabled is just kind of free, right? That is a problem in a game design set. So you don't want it to be too much stronger if you get the reward. I think what I would like is for it to be less weaker if you don't set up the cryo thing, or maybe for these weapons to just not be as similar, you know. Maybe they activate in different, maybe the archaic requires a charge attack, or the Star Silver requires a charge attack but it does a bit more damage, something like that, making them a little less similar. I think you picked an amazing example, EyePatchNotes, because these weapons are shockingly similar. Like, it's basically the same thing. Now again, people who actually play Genshin Impact, obviously we're glossing over a few things. The Star Silver gives you physical damage as its secondary stat. The Archaic gives you attack instead. There are a few small differences that we're not focusing on, because it's not really the point. Again, that it'll vary. Although it's worth noting that for each of the weapons, those bonuses both affect the weapon's damage. So physical damage or attack, it is going to make the weapon's effect do more damage. Obviously, how useful the rest of it will be depends on the character you're playing, but that's the whole point of this entire parlay, is that this all depends on the character you're playing. So I thought this was a really good visual example of that. Of how it does depend on the character you're playing and what you can gain if you don't do the long setup, but then that longer setup does give you some damage. And then again, like, you might be playing a team where you just have a bunch of cryo, so you don't really have to wait for the internal cooldown on cryo. You could just do this stuff, you know, set up superconduct, and then on the schedule in column A, until you hit 5 out of 5 the normal attack, you're just bombarding the enemy with a bunch of cryo stuff. You don't really have to wait, maybe, in the right team, meaning that there isn't any cost in the context of that one team. But if you were to then advise people, like, oh, there's no cost to activating this, just use it when you have a cryo team, whatever, that's a bad advice. Many people don't. What does a cryo team mean? How much is enough? Against what kinds of fights? Like, what about how frequently that just doesn't work? And EyePatchNotes is another good example here. Part of the perceived friction for sets like Blizzard Strayer, for example. Blizzard Strayer gives you crit chance, a lot of crit chance, if you have cryo on enemies, so pretty similar to the Star Silver. And it also gives you even more crit chance if the enemy's frozen, cryo and hydro. But the problem is that claymores, geo, and pyro damage all break frozen, freeze. This is good because it does damage, but it's bad because it means you have to avoid a geo, Cairo, and Claymore characters. Like, dude, that's a third of the characters in the game. And if you don't, then you don't get that value out of Blizzard Strayer. EyePatchNotes says, depending on the player's account, a cohesive team that dodges all of those bullets might just be impractical, and some enemies can't be frozen at all. So there is that question of, you know, how much value are you getting there? For me, a Blizzard Strayer is kind of saved by, again, you do get some crit chance if you have cryo on the enemy, and it's a lot. So I think it's a decent artifact set, even if it didn't even have that thing about freezing enemies. Giving 20% crit chance, and then you get the cryo damage bonus from the 2-piece set bonus, makes it a good gear set, I think. But I completely understand, it's a good example, that it has the same problem as Star Silver, where it's like, well, your character's power level sort of violently fluctuates unless you plan to limit them, or you sort of always cater to those hoops. And again, how much the player will have trouble catering to those hoops, how much the player wants to cater to those hoops, how much the player is able to limit how often they use the character, that all varies on the person's personality, what they find fun, and it also depends on what characters they have, what their account is like. You can transfer that stuff over to any game you might be playing. It isn't quantifiable in a way that is good general advice. The only good general advice is to just discuss the two pieces. And I think that this is a rather reasonable discussion of it. Yeah, for example, I'm a player where, you know, I don't like Snow Tomb Star Silver, the Claymore in this example, but I do use Blizzard Strayer a lot, even though it is kind of niche in the same way. I use it on a character that I simply never use, that isn't useful to my account, except when I'm making a freeze theme. Kaya, for my account, a character you get as a starter character, is simply not of value to my account unless I'm building a freeze theme. So I know it's not going to be interfered with by like Geo or Pyro. I'm simply never going to want to use that character when I I'm doing that thing. Obviously, future updates might change that, but probably not. I'm only going to get even more options. One of those options might make me want to use Kaya and then also those things, and then I would get burned and want to rebuild him. But that's really what we're discussing here. Like, obviously, things like Blizzard Strayer and Star Silver are good when they're on the right team. So the question is, how much am I going to have to like backpedal or something, or worry about that when building a team? How much is it going to limit me or cause me to need to switch things up or go get something new? And considering that is it just depends on a lot of personal factors. There isn't really a way to quantify it. Yeah, Blizzard Strayer is a really good example of that. Yeah, I'm kind of the same kind of player to sort of talk about this subject a little more formally now. Reading through your example, it's really helpful, I hope, and is a good way to demonstrate, like it costs all these things and you don't gain that much. Doesn't that, the weapon is kind of like telling you, oh, but what if you fail to get this extra damage? I really like that way of conceptualizing it, that you're kind of like haunted, you said, by the noodle tier damage that you might get. I think it's a really effective way to demonstrate how you and I too feel about these things. It's just like, is it really worth it? And the carrot just isn't there, I don't think. There are other cases where a team is built on really specific reaction orders, kind of like in this example. In theory, there are teams that I play a lot that kind of require the same kind of schedule as in column A over here. And the difference is that it happens so often that I just don't care if it messes up a few times, or the failure is kind of divested because there isn't as much of a punishment. Let me give you an example. So I play Xingqiu and Diluc a lot. Diluc is a big chonky Claymore pyro attacker on whom I use Prototype Archaic, our orange weapon over here. And Xingqiu puts out a ton of hydro, so they can react with each other. You can get big vaporizes. Now, sometimes the order of Diluc getting his pyro attacks and Xingqiu firing off his hydro arrows, blades, isn't quite right. But the thing is, like, I get damage anyway, and it happens like every second, literally every second. It's got a 1 second cooldown, so I just don't care. Whereas with this, it's like you get 10 or 15 second cycles. If you miss it, you do lose like kind of more damage, or you can't just do it again. It kind of evens out when you're doing it these other ways. And there are cases as well, like with the Xingqiu and Diluc thing. Xingqiu puts out so much hydro that it's almost a little bit more foolproof. Like, you don't worry as much about like, oh, is it enough? It's like, it's way more than enough. You're fine. And I'm not great at the sequencing anyway. I play that team using Official as well. So Xingqiu and Official bombard enemies with a bunch of hydro and electro, which makes electrocharged, and that reaction doesn't consume the electro or the hydro. They both stay on. It's the only reaction that does that. So when I hit them with pyro, I get vaporized and an extra overloaded from the electro and get 2 reactions at once, which is obviously a lot of damage. I have found that even if I perform 0 micromanagement, I just use the abilities, I pretty consistently get that off. So I'm simply not worried about how much damage I'm losing because the game doesn't really tell me to be worried. I think that's part of why. It's probably not any less of a loss in damage. I'm totally on board with the idea that I'm probably losing big damage on that team by not sequencing a certain way. But with the Star Silver, asymptomatic for my stream, EyePatchNotes, I've made that mistake before. You make a good point that like the Star Silver like says on it in the weapon description, it's like, hey, you get way less damage if you don't do this thing. Just reminding you of your inadequacy. And like, I just don't like that. I totally get it. Yeah. An interesting point, a way to say it that I hadn't thought of before. So I hope that's an interesting way for all of you to think about those things. If there's a weapon you kind of bounce off of and you don't really know why, or just a character, a build option in any game, it doesn't have to be Genshin Impact, certainly. That might be part of why. It might be because there's this sort of fail state and you don't feel like the reward is high enough, or it just feels like pressure, maybe. You don't want to feel like you have to sort of sequence or combo it. I really take a lot of joy in games like this, in finding places where these things that you should need to synergize with kind of just happen automatically, or where the thing is so good anyway that it's okay that you're not like building to its strengths. Another example, I use Official has the Tenacity of the Millilith artifact set. Now that set gives a primary benefit of increasing your shield strength, and Official doesn't have any shields. She doesn't make shields. So that part of the artifact set is inherently wasted on her by herself. But I've noticed as I play Genshin Impact that I so frequently play a character with a shield on teams with Fischl that it just doesn't really, it's not important to worry about like, is that losing too much value? Like such a large percentage of the time I actually am using that effect just on someone else. And furthermore, Fischl doesn't have a ton of other good artifacts to use anyway. Looking at the various sets we have in the game right now, she just isn't losing as much. There isn't as much of an opportunity cost to running that and not getting all the value out of that set compared to running something else. So I'm okay with that compromise. There just isn't as much of a cost. Again, I think in this example, if you could do column B and the damage was less behind column C, I think a lot more people would be okay with the Star Silver, feeling like, oh, if you set up its conditions, you get a little extra damage. And if you don't, you lose a little damage. And the problem with it at the moment is, do you lose a ton of damage if you don't set up its conditions? It's kind of bad if you don't set its conditions up. And while both weapons are relatively equal to craft once you've unlocked them, you start with the Archaic unlocked. You have to unlock the Star Silver, so it's pretty likely that the player already has an Archaic, and then they get shown this weapon that says, I do way less damage unless you do this thing, in which case I do like a little more damage. And the player says, no, like what? No, it's just not enough, you know? Again, if you want to combine them and have the math, I've been saying like a little more damage, whatever. Let's say that you do column A, so that takes like 10 seconds because the cooldown of the activation is on the Star Silver is 10 seconds, and then column C. So we're doing column A and column C. Again, it could be column D, but just for the damage. You get the same superconduct physical resistance reduction, and you get 3.6 times your attack as damage 3 times over 30 seconds, or you get 4.8 times your attack as damage 2 times over 30 seconds. Without actually doing the math, you can quickly see that the 4.8 times twice is a little bit less than 10 times your attack as damage, and 3.6 times 3 is a little bit more than 10 times your attack as damage. So the difference is pretty marginal. Like it's not much damage. For perspective, actually, the damage difference is about the same as column B happening 1 time. So you're basically like if you fail 1 time out of 4 with the Star Silver, and you succeed 3 times out of 4, it takes a little longer. Obviously, that's not equivalent to 2 times with the Archaic, but that is about how much of a difference. Like you get 1 failed activation of Star Silver every 3 successes compared to just using the Archaic and then you don't have to do any of this. That just isn't enough for most people. Like I think for some people it will be, but that threshold, that decision making to think about for yourself, is that enough increased damage? Not to say, is it more damage? Because it's usually trivial to figure out whether it's like a lot more or not. Even just looking at these 2 examples, you don't really have to do math to look at the 4.8 times every 15 seconds and 3.6 times every 10 seconds to know, like, okay, roughly every 30 seconds, it's about the same. You know what I mean? Like one of them is probably better. Again, you can quickly figure out that column A is better damage. But if it costs practically anything that loses you damage, it probably falls right back behind. And indeed, I'm sure it does. If you lose basically any damage, enabling the weapon, it isn't better than the Archaic for that team in that situation for you as a player. But those numbers aren't meaningful until you understand like what that cost is to you as the player. Do you have to build restrictively in a way that your account isn't ready for? Do you just not like enabling it? Do you simply find it unfun to worry about like how much damage you're losing or whatever? Do you know that one is good and so it's not worth investing in building copies of the other? This time I mean investing like building Star Slivers. You might already have an Archaic at a good refine rank. If they're very similar and one is a little better, but you have to pay this many resources, is it worth it? And generally when I talk about build options in games, I assume that you have everything unlocked. And that's not because you should act like you have everything unlocked. It's because that's the way to compare things and to think, with everything unlocked, how much does it feel worth using the Star Silver? And if that amount is so small as to kind of offset the need to unlock it, then maybe you shouldn't, that helps you decide, I hope, by me demonstrating, this is what you would get. Is that worth it to you? And for a lot of players, again, I think the answer is just no. It's not enough. It doesn't reward you highly enough. Anyway, really interesting examples. EyePatchNotes has a little closing statement. Games with robust buildcraft will have pieces that combo together, intentionally or otherwise. This is kind of a problem for every game with interesting build options. Not a problem, but a consideration. My buildcraft, EyePatchNotes' buildcraft, revolves around tying combo pieces as tightly as I can in pursuit of accessibility. Tying them, in other words, like if I'm going to use this thing that is combo-y, I want it to be connected to this other thing that enables it. Is that what you mean? I'm not sure. After all, how else could I sell, okay, a spoiler, a barbarian fighter multiclass in D&D with a German suplexing Siberian unicorn without a logical through line and an all-in-one turn action economy? Maybe someday. I would love to hear about that. Yeah, D&D is a great example. I think at the end here, if people listen through this, I want to make sure it's clear that this does apply to every other game. There's the opportunity cost of D&D, multiclassing. You take a class level instead of another one. So if you're a fighter at level 3 and you level up, you can become a level 1 barbarian and a level 3 fighter. You don't become a level 4 fighter and a level 1 barbarian. You have to sacrifice leveling up as a fighter to level up as a barbarian, which often means that multiclassing in D&D makes you kind of okay at 2 classes rather than great at 1 class. I mentioned before a little bit that, a different player's tolerances for comboing items together or enabling things, that's going to depend on the game too, which is why evaluating this, like especially genre evaluating this, is not helpful, because you need to think about what the game does to make it easier or harder, more or less reasonable to guesstimate, to build something intuitive. Genshin Impact, for its part, I think is a game that does a really good job of making builds be intuitive. You can build basically the damaging stats in the game. Your character scales with attack and their electro, and they can crit, then build attack, electro, and crit, and you will do very good damage. You will do close to the maximum amount of damage that character could do with different decisions given your equipment. So you don't need to worry too much about, unless you just want to crunch the numbers, you don't really need to worry about that. The game is designed in a way where the challenges can never be so tight as to require you to do that math while remaining accessible to a meaningful number of players. They're just not going to make anything in the game that is challenging on the level where you would need to care about that unless you simply want to. And again, there are some very extreme outlier examples where maybe you do actually need to think about that. But nothing that has been majorly rewarding in Genshin Impact ever has required that. I've played every single content release in Genshin Impact. There's nothing in Genshin Impact I have not done, and there has never ever been a thing that rewarded you meaningfully, like a significant amount. Everyone's tolerance for that's different. For knowing exactly what combination was 1% more damage. It just doesn't matter in that game. If you want to care about it, that's fine. But this is a theme. If you value that, you have to make sure you understand whether the game values that. Because if you're doing it to get sick value, nearly every commercially successful game simply doesn't give you anything in exchange for doing that. Because if they did, then the game would be woefully inaccessible. A really good commercial example is StarCraft, a game that can be fun casually, but at a higher level is so hilariously inaccessible that you just can't play it without spending an amount of time that most people don't. StarCraft is only my example, of course. If you in chat say, I'm here in the comments and I played StarCraft for 5 days and I'm the highest level StarCraft player, yeah, whatever, but you get the point as an example. It's a game where it really asks a lot of you, making it relatively inaccessible that way. There are other games like this. Hunt Showdown is a game like this, where you simply need such a level of tactical planning to not just get murdered that most people just can't or won't think about it enough to get to that point. I don't think there's something wrong with that necessarily, but it does say something about, will games consistently reward that thing? No, you don't really need to evaluate each game that way. They will reliably not reward that level of analysis because it just doesn't make sense to do that. If most players don't do it, then most of your players won't enjoy that part of the game. Again, I have my own feelings. I think that games like Hunt Showdown existing and being sort of successful, like, definitely says something about how the audience feels about that. I'm reminded of Dark Souls' success, a time in gaming where things were getting like really easy. We kind of got the meme of the game journalist who like can't jump out of the starting area, that whole era. And then somebody made a game that was just like really hard and rather punishing. And people liked it because they did actually want that. The marketing people had assumed that would be inaccessible to people. I think those market trends are pretty trackable, and I think that we've reached a decent equilibrium at the moment where there are plenty of games that are hard that are commercially viable. The thing about this Buildcraft thing, though, is it's not hard, really, to do the math. It's just tedious for a lot of people. If you like doing that, no judgment whatsoever. I'm just trying to make a point about whether games are going to reward you for doing that thing that you like, and they almost never will. And I hope that that is helpful rather than frustrating, to know that it's something you would do if you like doing it, not something that will really ever be systematically rewarding. It just doesn't make sense for it to be. If the game developer knows what they're doing, which I think in Genshin Impact's case, they do, at least enough for this to be useful advice. But there are other examples. Again, Genshin Impact does have this sort of like, you can make a build for a character that isn't just the most straightforward thing in the world, but is intuitively good, and it will be good. In other words, Razor could reasonably be built with both of these weapons. They make great sense for him. They're both totally reasonable decisions. You could also pick something a lot weirder. You could pick something like Rain Slasher. Rain Slasher gives you damage when enemies have Hydro or Electro on them, and it also gives you Elemental Mastery, so your reactions do more damage. If you build Razor for using one of those two weapons, but then you put Rain Slasher on him, and you do put Hydro characters on the team, they will do surprisingly equivalent levels of damage. You don't have to like math it out and make sure. The game is just designed in a way where it's not like the same damage or anything, but you get a roughly equivalent level of effectiveness because the game's math is just relatively sound and it's kind of built for that. D&D is a great counterexample of a game where the burden is on the player. If you go off the beaten path, the game makes no promises that you will be effective. D&D's math, 5th edition's math, is designed around the idea that you take a single class character and you get your stat to 20, your attacking stat or whatever, your dexterity, your strength, your intelligence, whatever you're killing enemies with, fireballs, a mallet, a bow, I don't know. You get that stat to 20 as quickly as possible. The game's math is built around that. So if you don't do that, the burden is kind of on the player to multi-class and find something powerful enough, a powerful enough synergy to make up for that fact that they lost that natural progression. And you often don't. If you make every possible multiclassing character, that would be, tens of thousands of characters. You take a fighter and you're a level 5 fighter, but then you iterate that. You say, okay, I'm a level 4 fighter and a level 1 barbarian. I'm a level 3 fighter and a level 2 monk. I'm a level 3 fighter and a level 2 ranger. I don't know, but just all those, right? Very few of them are more effective than just a level 5 fighter. But the ones that are do something like kind of unique in exchange, like you roughly match the damage, and sometimes maybe you have higher damage. Occasionally you just have other capabilities. You probably have more things you can do. They're just not as individually powerful, so they have to synergize to make up for that deficit. I think this is very good, but it's very different from Genshin Impact. It's a game where if you are a player who wants to think out like a really interesting build combination, the game says, okay, well, we're not going to just give it to you. You have to make something interesting or it's not worth it. But the fact that it's usually not worth it isn't a problem, because if you're the type of player who doesn't want to think out a powerful combination, the game is balanced around you not doing that. So you could just play a single class character and you'll keep up. This allows the game to be accessible for players that don't want to think about that and players that do, without giving either player a major handicap or advantage, by making it the game kind of rises to the challenge of you, the player, trying to come up with something clever. That's really good. Genshin Impact kind of does it the opposite way by innately giving you value, and then the burden is on you, the player, to make a team of characters that combine in an interesting way. You don't have to worry about, like, will my character basically do damage? Like, yeah, whatever. Genshin Impact doesn't really care as much about that, I would argue. It's more interested in, like, okay, but how are you going to use that? Are you going to... what rotation are you planning to do? And if you do B or C, so you do a little less work, what are you going to put in the space, the time that you saved? How are you going to use that to get some value? And the game is more asking that question. It doesn't require the player to, like, make sure they have good enough damage. That is largely not a primary concern in Genshin Impact at higher levels. You're mostly worried about, what is the composition, or is your team compatible with the fight that you're trying to complete? Have you thought about what the enemies are and what characters you own that are good against them? Games just have different ways of doing these things, and I think it's interesting to compare how this mindset can apply to those games, and to note that you might be really into combos in one game but really bummed out by another. Basically, my sort of hook, EyePatchNotes, I hope you don't mind me kind of co-opting the end of this, Parley, is that having a play style is really working against you. Like, if you are, like, think of yourself as, like, a kind of person, or, like, having a play style, the video gaming is against you. Games are kind of fighting against that, because different games will reward that way of thinking more or less. And I think that it is much more beneficial to think about what specific elements, or, like, what thresholds of tolerance you have for these kinds of elements, rather than I like combos or not, I like synergy or not. I thought like that for a long time, and then realized that it doesn't work. It depends on the game. Like in Genshin Impact, I think synergies in gear, like combos between weapons and artifact sets and stuff, are not rewarding enough in Genshin Impact. It's just not really worth it. And it's much more teams or element combinations, mechanical, like the order of you doing abilities. That stuff is highly rewarding in this game. But if I like making a really particular build that only works with this team composition or against these enemies, Genshin Impact simply doesn't offer a very large carrot for doing that. And I don't think that's a bad thing. But if I didn't think of it as, how much of a reward is enough for me to want to do this, if I didn't think of it that way, and I thought, like, I just want combos, I probably wouldn't have very much fun playing this game, because I'd be playing it in a way that the game is not interested in. You can blame the game for that, sure, but I can have a lot more fun if I go into the game knowing, okay, I would normally want to do this, but I normally want to do that because the game rewards me with, big damage or whatever. But this game doesn't. Instead, it rewards this. Do I like that? I do like that. So cool. I'm fine with this game. This is what I meant earlier when I said how, like, genres, for example, just aren't helpful when deciding if you're going to take a look at a game or if you'll like a game. You need to think about specifically what the game is going to reward. And the only way to do that is to watch a review where the person brings that out. So I will do my best to deliver that to you.